Chapter 69. It took July only a day or two to determine that Elmira was not in Dodge City. The town was a shock to him, for almost every woman in it seemed to be a whore and almost every business a saloon. He kept trying to tell himself he shouldn't be surprised, for he had heard for years that Kansas towns were wild. In Missouri, where he had gone to testify at the trial, there was much talk of Kansas. People in Missouri seemed to consider that they had gotten rid of all their riffraff to the cow towns. July quickly concluded that they were right. There might be rough elements in Missouri, but what struck him in Texas was the absence of any elements that weren't rough. Of course, there were a few stores and a livery stable or two in Dodge, even a hotel of sorts, though the whores were in and out of the hotel so much that it seemed more like a whorehouse. Gamblers were thick in the saloons, and he had never seen a place where as many people went armed. The first thing July did was buy a decent horse. He went to the post office, for he felt he owed Fort Smith an explanation as to why he had not come back. For some reason, he felt a surge of optimism as he walked down the street to the post office. Now that he had survived the plains, it seemed possible that he could find Ellie after all. He had lost all interest in catching Jake's spoon. He just wanted to find his wife and go home. If Peach didn't like it, and she wouldn't, she would just have to lump it. If Ellie wasn't in Dodge, she would probably be in Abilene. He would soon catch up with her. But to his surprise, the minute he stepped inside the door of the post office, his optimism gave way in a flash to bitter depression. In trying to think of what he would say in his letter, he remembered all that had happened. Roscoe was dead. Joe was dead. The girl was dead, and Ellie not found. Maybe she, too, was dead. All he had to report was death and failure. At the thought of poor Roscoe, gutted and left under a pile of rocks on the prairie, his eyes filled up with tears, and he had to turn and walk back out the door to keep from embarrassing himself. He walked along the dusty street for a few minutes, wiping the tears out of his eyes with his shirt sleeve. One or two men observed him curiously. It was obvious that he was upset, but no one said anything to him. He remembered walking into the post office in Fort Worth and getting the letter that told him about Ellie. Since then, it had all been puzzlement and pain. He felt that in most ways, it would have been better if he had died on the plains with the rest of them. He was tired of wandering and looking. But he hadn't died, and eventually he turned and went back to the post office, which was empty except for an elderly clerk with a white mustache. "Well, you're back," the clerk said. "That was you a while ago, wasn't it?" "That was me," July admitted. He bought an envelope, a stamp, and a couple of sheets of writing paper, and the clerk, who seemed kindly, loaned him a pencil to write with. "You can write it right here at the window," the clerk said. "We're not doing much business today." July started, and then, to his embarrassment, began to cry again. His memories were too sad, his hopes too thin. To have to say things on paper seemed a terrible task, for it stirred the memories. "I guess somebody died and you got to write to their folks, is that it?" the clerk said. "Yes," July said. "Only 2 of them didn't have no folks." He vaguely remembered that Roscoe had a few brothers, but none of them lived around Fort Smith or had been heard of in years. He wiped his eyes on his shirt sleeve again, reflecting that he had cried more in the last few weeks than he had in his whole life up to that point. After standing there, staring at the paper for a few minutes, he finally wrote a brief letter addressed to Peach. "Dear Peach, Roscoe Brown was killed by a bad outlaw, so was Joe. A girl named Janie was also killed. I don't know much about her. Roscoe said he met her in the woods. I don't know when I will be back. The folks can hire another sheriff if they want to. Somebody has to look after our town. Your brother-in-law, July Johnson." He had already pretty well convinced himself that Elmira was not in Dodge City, for he had been in every public place in town and had not seen her. But since the old clerk seemed kindly, he thought he might as well ask. Maybe she had come in to mail a letter at some point. "I'm looking for a woman named Elmira," he said. "She's got brown hair and she ain't very big." "Ellie?" the clerk said. "Why, I ain't seen Ellie in 2 or 3 years. Seems like I heard she moved to Abilene." "That's her," July said, encouraged again all of a sudden. Ellie had been living in Abilene before she moved to St. Joe, where he had found her. "I thought she might have come back," he added. "No, I ain't seen her," the clerk said. "But you might ask Jenny up at the third saloon. She and Elmira used to be thick once. I think they even married the same man, if you want to call it married." "Oh, Mr. Boot?" July asked. "Yes, D. Boot, the scoundrel," the clerk said. "How could he be married to the 2 of 'em?" July asked, not sure he wanted the information, but unable to stop talking to a man who could tell him something about Ellie. "Why, D. Boot would bed down with a possum if the possum was female. He was a cutter with the ladies." "Didn't he die of smallpox?" July asked. The clerk shook his head. "Not as far as I know," he said. "He's up in Ogallala or Deadwood or somewhere where there's lots of whores and not too much law. I imagine he's got 5 or 6 whores in his string right now. Of course, he could have died, but he's my nephew, and I ain't heard no news to that effect." "Thank you for the loan of the pencil," July said. He turned and walked out. He went straight to the livery stable and got his new horse, whose name was Pete. If Elmira wasn't in Dodge, she might be in Abilene, so he might as well start. But he didn't start. He rode halfway out of town, and then he went back to the third saloon from the post office and inquired about the woman named Jenny. They said she had moved to another bar up the street. A cowboy was even kind enough to point out the bar. A herd had been sold that morning and was being loaded onto boxcars. July rode over and watched the work a while. Slow work, and made slower by the cattle's long horns, which kept getting tangled with one another as the cattle were being forced up the narrow loading chute. The cowboys yelled and popped their quirts, and the horses behaved expertly, but despite that, it seemed to take a long time to fill a boxcar. Still, July liked the look of the cowboys. He always had, even when they got a little rowdy, as they sometimes did in Fort Smith. They were young and friendly, and seemed not to have a care in the world. They rode as if they were grown to their horses. Their teamwork when the cattle misbehaved and tried to break out was interesting to see. He saw a cowboy rope a running steer by the horns and then cleverly trip it so that the steer fell heavily. When the animal rose, it showed no more fight and was soon loaded. After watching the loading for a while, he went back to the saloon where the woman named Jenny was said to work. He inquired for her at the bar, and the bartender, a skinny runt, said she was busy and asked if he wanted a whiskey. July seldom drank whiskey, but he said yes, to be courteous mainly. If he was taking up space in a bar, he ought to pay for it, he figured. So he took the whiskey and sipped it until it was gone, and then took another. Soon he was feeling heavy, as if it would be difficult to walk fast if he had to. But in fact, he didn't have to. Women came and went in the saloon, but the bartender who poured the whiskeys kept assuring him that Jenny would be down any minute. July kept drinking. It seemed to him that he was taking on weight in a hurry. He felt that just getting out of his chair would be more than he could do, he felt so heavy. The bartender kept bringing whiskeys, and it seemed to July he must be running up quite a bill, but it didn't worry him. Occasionally a cowboy would pass by, his spurs jingling. Some of them gave July a look, but none of them spoke to him. It was comfortable to sit in the saloon. As sheriff, he usually avoided them unless he had business in one. It had always puzzled him how some men could spend their days just sitting in a saloon, drinking, but now it was beginning to seem less puzzling. It was restful, and the heavy feeling that came with the drinking was a relief to him, in a way. For the last few weeks he had been struggling to do things which were beyond his powers. He knew he was supposed to keep trying, even if he wasn't succeeding, but it was pleasant not to try for a little while. Then he looked up and saw a woman standing by the table. She was skinny, like Elmira, and had stringy black hair. "Let's get going, cowboy," she said. "You can't do nothing sitting there." "Get going where?" he asked, taken by surprise. No one had ever called him cowboy before, but it was a natural mistake. He had taken off the sheriff's star for a few days, a precaution he often took in a strange town. "I'm Jenny," she said. "Sam said you were looking for me, or have I got the wrong cowboy?" "Oh," July said, embarrassed. He had even forgotten he was waiting for someone named Jenny. "We could get going, even if you ain't the right cowboy," Jenny said. "If you can afford that much whiskey, you can afford me. You could even buy me a drink if you felt polite." July had never in his life bought a woman a drink, or even sat with a woman who liked to drink. Any other time, such an invitation would have shocked him. But in this case, it just made him feel that his manners weren't all they should be. Jenny had huge brown eyes, too large for her thin face. She was looking at him impatiently. "Yes, have a drink," he said. "I'm running up a bill." Jenny sat down and waved at the bartender, who immediately appeared with a bottle. "This one's drinking like a fish," he said cheerfully. "I guess it's been a long, dry trail." July suddenly remembered why he was waiting to see the girl named Jenny. "Did you know Ellie?" he asked. "I heard you knowed her." It was Jenny's turn to be surprised. Elmira had been her best friend for 3 years, and she had hardly expected a drunken young cowboy to mention her name. "You mean Ellie Timms?" she asked. "Yes," July said. "That's the Ellie. I was hoping you had news of her. I don't know where she is." "Well, she moved to Missouri," Jenny said. "Then we heard she married a sheriff from Arkansas, but I didn't put no stock in that kind of rumor. I can't imagine Ellie staying married to no sheriff." "She didn't," July said. "She run off while I was chasing Jake Spoon, and I got 3 people killed since I started looking for her." Jenny looked at the young man more closely. She had noticed right off that he was drunk, but drunks were an everyday sight, and she had not looked close. The man seemed very young, which is why she had taken him for a cowboy. They were mostly just boys. But this man didn't have the look of a cowboy, once she looked close. He had a solemn face and sad eyes, the saddest she had looked into for a while. On the basis of the eyes, he was an unlikely man for Ellie to have married. Ellie liked her laughs, but then people often did unlikely things. "Are you a sheriff?" she asked, sipping the whiskey Sam had poured. "I was," July said. "I'm mostly likely gonna have to give it up." "Why do that?" Jenny asked. "I ain't a good fighter," July said. "I can crack a drunk on the head and get him to jail, but I ain't really a good fighter. When we rode into that camp, the man with me killed 6 or 7 men, and I never killed a one. I went off and left Roscoe and the others, and they got killed before I could get back. It was only Jake Spoon I went to catch, but I made a mess of it. I don't want to be a sheriff now." He had not expected such words to rush out. He had suddenly lost control of his speech somehow. Jenny had not expected it either. She sipped her whiskey and watched him. "They say Ellie left on a whiskey boat," July said. "I don't know why she would have done it, but that's what they say. Roscoe thought a bear might have got her, but they didn't see no tracks." "What's your name?" Jenny asked. "July Johnson," he said, glad that she was no longer looking at him quite so impatiently. "It sounds like Ellie to me," Jenny said. "When Ellie gets enough of a place, she jumps in the first wagon and goes. I remember when she went to Abilene, I didn't have no idea she was even thinking of leaving. And then, before it was even time to go to work, she had paid some mule skinners to take her, and she was gone." "I gotta find her," July said simply. "You come to the wrong town, mister," Jenny said. "She ain't in Dodge." "Well, then I'll just have to keep looking," July said. He thought of the empty plains, which it seemed to him he had been lucky to get across. There seemed only the smallest chance that Ellie would have been so lucky. "I fear she's dead," he said. "She's hunting Dee, I'd say," Jenny said. "Did you know Dee?" Why, no, July said. I was told he died of smallpox. Jenny chuckled. He ain't dead, she said. He's in Ogallala. There's a gambler sitting right over there who's seen him not 2 months ago. Where? July asked, and Jenny pointed to a pudgy man in a white shirt and black coat who sat alone at a table shuffling cards. That's Webster Witter, Jenny said. He keeps up with D. Boot. I used to, but I quit. Why? July asked. He sensed that it was a rather loose-tongued question, but the fact was his tongue was out of control and behaving ever more loosely. It's like trying to keep up with the tumbleweed, Jenny said. D wears out one town and then he's off to another. I ain't that way. I like to settle in. I've been here in Dodge 5 years already, and I guess this is where I'll stay. I don't know why she married me, July said. I ain't got any idea about it. Jenny looked at him for a bit. Do you always drink like this? She asked. No, I seldom drink, July said, though I do like toddy in the winter. Jenny looked at him a while. You ought to stop worrying about Ellie, mister, she said. No man's ever been able to stop Ellie for long, not even Dee. She married me, July said. He felt he had to insist on that point. Well, I married Dee once myself, Jenny said. I just did it because he was good-looking. That and the fact that I was mad at somebody else. Ellie and me are a lot alike, she added. July just looked at her sadly. Jenny sighed. She had not expected to encounter such misery in the middle of the afternoon. You're right good-looking, she said. I expect that explains it. If I were you, I'd start getting over it. I gotta find her, July said. I gotta tell her about little Joe. He got killed on the Canadian. She oughtn't have had him, Jenny said. I told her not to. I wouldn't have won for anything. I've had offers, too. July drank 2 more whiskeys, but had little more to say. Well, the bar's getting rich, but I ain't, Jenny said. Don't you want a little fun to take your mind off it? It seemed to July that he was not so much sitting in the chair as floating in it. The world seemed kind of watery to him, but it was all right because he was easily able to float. Jenny giggled, looking at him. You sure are drunk, Mr. Johnson, she said. Let's go have a little fun. I always liked stealing Ellie's boys, and here I've got a chance to steal her husband. The way she giggled made July feel happy suddenly. He had not heard a woman giggle in a long time. Ellie never giggled. So he got up and followed Jenny up the stairs, walking carefully so as not to embarrass himself. He got upstairs all right, but before they could get to Jenny's room, he began to feel wrong. His stomach began to float higher than he was. It began to float right out of his mouth. Jenny had kept a close eye on him, and she quickly guided him to the outside stairs. July knelt down on the little landing and vomited over the edge. The next thing he knew, he was lying flat on the landing, still vomiting. From time to time, he quit vomiting and just lay there. But then he would start again, his body heaving upward like a bucking horse. He held to the rail of the landing with one hand so he wouldn't accidentally heave himself over. It was a bright day, the Kansas sun beating down, but July felt like he was in darkness. Cowboys rode up and down the street below him. Once in a while, one would hear him vomiting and look up and laugh. Wagons went by, and the drivers didn't even look up. Once, while he was resting, 2 cowboys stopped and looked at him. I guess we ought to rope him and drag him to the graveyard, one said. He looks dead to me. Hell, I wish all I had to do was lay on them stairs and vomit, the other cowboy said. It beats loading them longhorns. July lay face down for a long time. The heaves finally diminished, but from time to time he raised his head and spat over the edge to clear his throat. It was nearly sundown before he felt like sitting up, and then it was only to sit with his back against the building. He was high enough that he could see over the main street and the cattle pens and west to where the sun was setting far off on the plain. It was setting behind a large herd of cattle, being held a mile or 2 from town. There were thousands of cattle, but only a few cowboys holding them. He could see the other cowboys racing for town. The dust their running horses kicked up was turned golden by the sun. No doubt they were just off the trail and couldn't wait for a taste of Dodge, the very taste he had just vomited up. The last sunlight filtered through the settling dust behind the cowboys' horses. July sat where he was until the afterglow was just a pale line on the western horizon. The white moon shone on the railroad ties that snaked out of town to the east. He felt too weak to stand up, and he sat listening to the sounds of laughter that came from the saloon behind him. When he finally stood up, he was indecisive. He didn't know if he should go in and thank Jenny or just slip away and continue the search for Elmira. He had an urge to just ride on out into the dark country. He didn't feel right in a town anymore. The crowds of happy cowboys just made him feel more lonesome somehow. On the plains, with nobody in sight, he wasn't reminded so often of how cut off he felt. He decided, though, that politeness required him to at least say goodbye to Jenny. As he stepped back in the door, a cowboy came out of her room looking cheerful and went clumping down the stairs. A moment later, Jenny came out too. She didn't notice July standing there. To his astonishment, she stopped and lifted her skirts so that he saw her thin legs and more. There was a smear of something on one thigh, and she hastily wet her fingers with a little spit and wiped it off. Just then she noticed July, who wished he had not bothered to come through the door. He had never seen a woman do such an intimate thing, and the shock was so strong he thought his stomach might float up again. When Jenny saw him, she was not very embarrassed. She giggled again and lowered her skirts. "Well, you got a free look, but I won't count it," she said. "I guess you didn't die." "No," July said. Jenny looked closely at him as if to make sure he was all right. She had a poor complexion, but he liked her frank brown eyes. "What about the fun?" she said. "You lost out this afternoon." "Oh," July said, "I'm not much fun." "I guess you wouldn't be after vomiting up your stomach," Jenny said. "I can't wait, though, mister. 3 herds came in today, and there's a line of cowboys waiting to fall in love with me." She looked down the stairs. The noise from the saloon was loud. "It's what I did with Ellie," July said. Meeting her friend Jenny had made his life clearer to him suddenly. He was as simple as the cowboys. He had fallen in love with a whore. Jenny looked at him a moment. She had come out of her room briskly, prepared for more business, but something in July's eyes slowed her down. She had never seen eyes with so much sadness in them. To look at him made her heart drop a little. "Ellie was tired of this business," she said. "It was the buffalo hunters made her decide to quit. I guess you just come along at the right time." "Yes," July said. They were silent, looking at one another. Jenny reluctant to go down to the well of noise. July not ready to go out the door and head for the livery stable. "Don't you want to quit?" he asked. "Why, are you going to fall in love with me too?" Jenny asked in a frank way. July knew he could if he wasn't careful. He was so lonely, and he didn't have much control. "Don't you want to quit?" he asked again. Jenny shook her head. "I like to see the boys coming in," she said. "People are always coming in here in Dodge. The cowboys are nicer than the buffalo hunters, but even the buffalo hunters was people." She thought a moment. "I couldn't sit around in a house all day," she said. "If someone was ever to marry me, I expect I'd run off too. The time I get blue is the winter. There ain't no people coming in." July thought of Ellie, sitting in the cabin loft all day, dangling her legs. No people came in at all except him and Joe, and Roscoe once in a while when they caught a catfish. Hearing Jenny talk put his life with Ellie in a very different light. "You ought to go on back home," Jenny said. "Even if you catch her, it won't do no good." July feared it wouldn't, but he didn't want to go back. He just stood there. Something in his manner made Jenny suddenly impatient. "I gotta go," she said. "If you ever do find Ellie, tell her I still got that blue dress she gave me. If she ever wants it back, she'll have to write." July nodded. Jenny gave him a final look, half pitying, half exasperated, and hurried on down the stairs. July felt sad when she left. He had the feeling that an opportunity had been missed, though he didn't know what kind of opportunity. The streets were full of cowboys going from one saloon to the next. There were horses tied to every hitch trail. He went to the livery stable and saddled his new horse. The old man who ran the stable was sitting with his back against a barrel of horseshoe nails, drinking now and then from a jug he had between his legs. July paid him, but the old man didn't stand up. "Which outfit are you with?" the old man asked. "I'm with myself," July said. "Oh," the man said. "A small outfit. This is a funny time of night to be starting out, ain't it?" "I guess it is," July said. But he started anyway.